So first off, I just want to thank Daisy, who's back there somewhere, hiding into the Thank you for organizing everything. You've done just a wonderful job every time we've done this. And I'm sad it's over. Who else will come up with these crazy ideas? Oh, all the other people doing this. So I'm going to sort of recap some of the things we talked about and introduce the speakers more formally so they can feel they've been properly taken care of. This project was, as I mentioned, brought to sort of my consciousness by the awareness of this project in California at Stanford called the Connectome, which is an effort to map every connection in the human brain and its semiotic potential. And I started thinking about this as an artist and how this was going to really change something I've always been interested in. Is like, is it possible for an artist to actually, well, one, think at all? We spend a lot of time just kind of, and then two, when we do think, like, how do we think? We think through objects. But if somebody made a map, I've always wondered this, and showed it to us, like if you come in an MFA program, it's like, here's a map of how you're going to think. You can sort of choose, you can go to Toronto or you can go to California, but we basically know where everyone's going to go. And this seemed to be the sort of downside of the World Wide Web and its potential for infinite knowledge. This is a map of the 1,300 companies, for example, that basically dominate all world capitalism. So we're getting good at making maps of everything, of brains, of the universe, of the filamentary structure. This is the first picture of the dark matter relationships in the universe. We're getting so good, but at the same time, it's turning everyone to this kind of person who spends a lot of time doing that. But then behind the scenes, there's this enormous complex of these kinds of buildings where it's all hidden. What's like powering this, what's paying for it, what the environmental costs. We don't see any of that anymore. We just see this. And so that's producing a kind of desolation, I think, in our kind of trauma for artists, where we start to imagine that we're this. And we're generating an image of ourselves for the international sort of community of biennials and so forth, of artists as a kind of performing clown. And it's not that I have anything against this kind of work. I love it. It's fantastic. And for people like Ryan, when you're in that moment, enjoying that, it's an incredible fun moment. But there's also this problem, like, are you really just becoming an embodiment of a systemic production system that likes Angelina Jolie a lot more than you? So, and maybe it's all really like this, not quite as much fun as it looks. That's Johnny Depp, who's apparently going to be digitized and turned into God in his next movie. And he gets paid a lot more than us. And so maybe this system is actually going to sort of disenfranchise our relationship with content the way Arthur Danto described the disenfranchisement of the philosophical relationship to the object happening in the 1970s. And then we're going to get a sort of like things, these are artists that I like, but I still see the problem endemic in this, that they could be sort of all maybe kind of the same work, just different iterations of variations of structure. And it's not that it's not a question of good versus bad, it's more a question of like, if this is a syndrome, we're going to be affected by the symptoms. And there's going to be more and more of these places where we can all sort of do our thing, but at a certain point, there's a limited number of things that we're all going to get, unless we find a way out of this. And this is a problem, that's the diagram of art practice that's been addressed for a long time, as I talked about before. This is not something that people haven't been anticipating, but it's turned into this kind of crowd logic, which derives, as Caroline Jones talked about in the second one of these talks, the shift of the modes of scientific subjectivity, which might as well be classified in a post-mechanical society, to all of us, from the genial, which is sort of the artist, to the statistical image, and then finally to the crowd logic, which is generated by sort of Instagram. So this is what she means by from genial metaphysics, which is like the gesture of the artist, to mechanical objectivity, which is a shift that took place in the 19th century. Now we're into the third phase. So artists tend to like think of their diagrams as, this is where we're comfortable. This is the comfort zone. It's Turner, and this is a kind of super cool diagram. Smithson. This is like where we like to think of, voice, like artist diagrams are kind of crazy. Then they start to get a little more mechanical, about Wagner. And then, but basically we think of the artist diagram as a nested, that's the technical term for a nested diagram, is where everything's sort of scrolled on top of each other, like H.P. Lovecraft's diagram here. And that was what I talked about in the show that I did called the temptation of the diagram. So what can we do against that? Well, one way is to think about time, the consequence of a diagram that proliferates through time rather than simply just representing multiple layers in space simultaneously, rather than representing them. So this is Mallarmé's Un coup de dé, which is essentially a diagram that's taken 100 years to decode what he meant by it, turn it into a poem. Another way is Duchamp's method of creating what Bettina Funke called the mutable archive, which is this kind of shadow cast forward through time, which appears to be a stable structure or mechanically objective, but in fact is constantly changing and shifting at the whim of the artist. This is, for me, very familiar to, these are Husserl's diagrams of the relationship to time, which is consistently referred to as sort of the most difficult thing in philosophy. But I think what Husserl was talking about was like an awareness of the consequences of diagrammatic thinking. Like if you make a diagram, it's actually, you can make a statement about what you're going to do in the future, and then you can get there. It's like the map that indicates something, and you're allowed to imagine a place, a utopia for yourself, in the sense of the utopia as being no place, where you can actually go. And this is what sort of Graham Harman talked about, is the ultimate inaccessibility of the so-called real object. We can never understand a star or a human or the absence of someone we love, but it is represented to us through a sensual object. And on this kind of what he calls the quadruple object, we can begin to superimpose different diagrammatic regimes. And this was something that just to recap Barabasi and Jones, Barabasi talked about scale-free networks. Networks are basically the interconnectivity of diagrams. How do they fit together? And it turns out there are rules. There are fixed relationships that are the same as everything. And these are the kinds of random network, a scale-free network, which occurs naturally in nature, and there are hierarchical networks like the internet. These are the kinds of ones that we build. And this affects everything. So this is the map of all the flavors in the world. This is you can do it with all the flavors in the world. This is all of the basic mathematical structures by Max Tegmark. There is nothing that cannot be essentially networked. The key for me in a diagram is like boiling that down to something you can use. This is the famous Feynman diagram, which he used to describe all of the possible relationships of electrons, and so quantum interactions can be described with this little funny little leggy diagram. And what he's showing you is that the constituent nature of atomic structures is that they all do this sort of same kind of thing. It doesn't really matter which ones go off here and there. Now, to describe a complex in sort of atomic structure would take you hundreds of Feynman diagrams, until this diagram was invented this year by Nima Hamed, which is called the amplitude-hedron. Basically, you need one of these to describe hundreds and hundreds of Feynman diagrams, showing you that you can achieve a higher order of unity out of what seems to be a super simple diagram, can itself contain within it, as it were, another potential diagram. It has all the potentials of all the diagrams. And that's what it looks like when you color it in. These are the waves of the amplitudes. So this is basically a drawing of how all of the particles of nature interact simultaneously. So this is sort of about this kind of formal relations, which for me starts in this distinction that we were talking about earlier between the diagram, which is the semasiographic or sign system, which produces the icon, and then what Frederik was talking about, which led to the famous language wars of the 1970s, which is the glottographic system. The glottographic system is sequential in time, so it implies a kind of mechanical forward motion. And this was one of the great sort of insistences of the great civilizations of the sort of 18th and 19th century, was the time be located as a specific and progressive structure and move forward in a kind of continuum. Semasiographic systems don't do that. You can go backwards and forwards. You can bounce around, which is why I like this crazy thing, the Prezi, that bounces around. So this is what a diagram can do. You can move between rules and systems and potentials and natural laws using Harman's quadratic layout. And you can move between what is with sort of a term that Quentin Mathew talks about, which is facticity, which is an endemic problem for the art world, which is the collection of a small number of extremely interesting facts, possibly from Wikipedia, possibly from your own biography. But whenever we all do it, say, well, I've got a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and then you kind of polish them up, present them like these little jewels of sort of archival, as facts. But they're all, as Mathew points out, and Ray Brassier point out, ultimately just subject to total contingency. They're just kind of random facts drawn from the universe. So the other quality that the diagram has to fight against is its surrender to contingency. This notion that Deleuze puts forward that the diagram is simply one of multiple forms of all diagrams, then all you need to do to change a diagram is just add another diagram, and so forth. I suppose why I'm bringing this up is I think there are consequences. The diagrams have to work. This is something I think we can talk about very much. Because otherwise they're not hypostatic abstractions. They're just scribbles. They're just nests. And this is so this is Charles Peirce's, triangle here. And then you can sort of, this is a way, what I've been thinking about is like how to actually have these things actually coexist. That's adding the previous diagram. This adds Deleuze's categories to the same diagram here. And I'll happily give this, I'm not expecting everyone to read these at this speed. Although really impressive if somebody did point it out. And then this is adding Deleuze and Peirce's diagrams to Harman's diagram. So the three of them all fit together there. And then this is sort of adding them to 16 other philosophical systems. And this is really me just sort of showing off that I did that. And then I turned them into flags for boats. So if you were lost at sea, you could like have this like, I'm a Latour fan, and someone else could hoist their little flag up and say, well, I like Harman, and then you could be like, the colors correspond to this. It would all get much simpler that way. And I was inspired to do all of this work on diagrams by Frederik Stjernfelt's extraordinary book, Diagrammatology, which unfortunately is rather expensive. So otherwise I would say you should all buy one. And we can't say, because it's Columbia, that you should all pirate with a PDF ID, but you should. But I'll happily give you an excerpt from that. And a kind of question that underlies that, the work for me is like, for us as practitioners, is like, is there a topology to this? Is there a space and a time in which diagrams mean more than just this sort of potential? And it's a very acute question, because when you're in the studio practicing, it's a practice of time and space and potential and imagination and real objects. All the things that constitute a diagram are what you do all the time. So if there's a way to sort of analyze this and to construct it, that was really the premise of the series. So the first, just to show you how carefully I thought this all through, not true at all. So we had Harman and Funke were representing the kind of these two poles, and then Barabasi and Jones representing some natural laws and systems, and then finally. So if you come to all of them, you now understand everything. But so I'm just going to introduce our speakers very briefly, so we don't feel that we know who they are. Kenneth Rogers is Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the Department of Film at York University. His interdisciplinary research and publication is concerned with the intersection of labor, attention, political economy, art practice, and digital media. The Attention Complex, 1 month old, and a masterpiece. I believe the first review was, it certainly got my attention. That's on the Amazon site. And Frederik Stjernfelt has a longer, the Danish writer and professor, this is from Wikipedia, I'm afraid, the Nordic Institute of Cognitive Semiotics, Faculty of Humanities, Aarhus.
That's not correct.
This is Wikipedia. See, already the corrosion begins. Which Wikipedia says about diagrammatology, it's about charts. But also, Barry Smith of SUNY on the review said diagrams will never be the same. He's also written extensively on a number of like highly interesting, and I hope we get a chance to talk about this a little bit later, and profoundly sort of disturbing sounding political subjects that sort of plague Europe, where the ability to sort of generate a mutually acceptable intersubjective diagram has eluded us for thousands of years. A stable map of Europe. We just can't seem to get it right.
That's right.
So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Stjernfelt. Thank you very much.
This is a storm of diagrams you are surrounding us with. Now I'm trying to get down to a bit of structure. No, I would rather shout. I would like to try to get down to some basic structural issues by introducing Charles Peirce, the American pragmatist and semiotician, and his approach to diagrams. That's a sort of central node in the book that Mathew just mentioned. That was because like 15 years ago I discovered that Peirce on the top of the famous semiotics that he made, that towards the end of his life he actually made a doctrine of diagrams and diagrammatical reasoning that was pretty overlooked. Not many people wrote about it, so I thought I had to sort of try to make a reconstruction of it, and that's what I did in the book that Mathew just mentioned. I got so caught up in this guy that I continued, and now I have another book coming out in a couple of months called Natural Propositions, going into Peirce's theory of propositions. I will not say much about that here, just this is a sort of small safety talk. But what is diagrams? Some of you might know one of the most famous set of distinctions that Peirce made was that between icons, indices, and symbols. We already touched upon that. Different connection types from signs to their objects. An icon is a sign that in some sense is similar to its object. Could be a painting, could be a photograph, but could also be algebra. Keep that in mind because that's may seem surprising for a first glance. Indices are signs that stands in a direct connection in time and space to their object. You know, smoke for fire, or a pointing gesture, or things like that. While symbols are signs that rely upon conventions or habit. I mean, like linguistic conventions, but it could also be habits in biology, so even symbols are not a human prerequisite. Here I have added Peirce's subcategories of icons: images, diagrams, metaphors, simply saying that images are icons which function by means of symbol qualities like shapes or colors or things like that. Diagrams is as soon as we have a part-whole structure in the sign which mirrors a part-whole structure in the object. And metaphor is when you make such a part-whole structure via a third object. I mean, like when you chart your ancestral relation by drawing the structure of an ancestral tree, then that tree will be the metaphor of your family structure. But the important thing here, or one among several important things, is that this distinction here is not primarily one of signs. We should not imagine the icon index symbol distinction in the same way as, for instance, lions, tigers, leopards, as sort of three distinct groups of signs out there. Actually, rather the opposite. Most interesting signs have both iconical, indexical, and symbolical relations at the same time. So very often in practice they are mixed, and that has to do with the fact that Peirce was a pragmatist. To him, use was very important. So the defining thing here is use. We can see that by taking one and the same sign vehicle, the crescent shape here, and we can see that the very same sign may in some contexts be used like an image, in other contexts as a diagram, and in still other contexts as a metaphor. How can that be? In the first case, we could take the crescent shape simply as an image of the moon, because we simply, due to the properties of our visual system, easily recognize the crescent shape and easily associate that to the moon. But we could also use exactly the same figure as a diagram if we, for instance, wanted to calculate the relation between the light parts of the moon and the dark parts of the moon, and if we were interested in how strong the light was as compared to the light of the full moon, we could use exactly the same sign to calculate that. In that case, we would use the same sign as a diagram. We could also use the same sign as a metaphor, referring first to the moon and then to the bread type of croissant. You know, the reason why we call that the croissant is that it has the same shape as the moon, or it could be referring to Islam or other metaphorical connections. So the very same sign could be used in these three ways. So what is it that's so interesting about icons? I think Peirce has made a very important definition of what similarity is, because immediately, of course, where we know similarity from is, of course, from immediate perceptual judgment. When we see a thing and we immediately judge it to be similar to another thing. So there has been a tendency to identify similarity with easily processable visual recognition and things like that. But I think that's erroneous, and Peirce has a more technical explanation of what similarity could be, and that comes here, and I think that's a non-trivial one. Here he says, for a great distinguishing property of the icon is that by the direct observation of it, other truths concerning its object can be discovered than those which suffice to determine its construction. So the idea here is that icons are signs which sort of have an implicit side, and we are able to make that explicit. And it is that which constitutes similarity. And that property of the icon is especially developed in diagrams. So what does he say about diagrams? He says lots and lots and lots of things, and I will not go through all of them here, but here's a very central and early quote. It's from the mid-80s, and he only really develops his diagram doctrine after the turn of the century. But already here he sort of had it in its germ version. Here he says, all deductive reasoning, that is necessary reasoning, even simple syllogism, involves an element of observation. That's already surprising. Namely, deduction consists in constructing an icon or diagram, the relation of whose parts shall present a complete analogy with those of the parts of the object of reasoning, of experimenting upon this image in the imagination, and of observing the result so as to discover unnoticed and hidden relations among the parts. I think that's very, compressed and central presentation of Peirce's idea pertaining to diagrams. I shall show you some examples in a while, but you can see the idea of experimenting and observing unnoticed relations is central here. So you can see that's a further development of the idea that similarity is something that has to do with making something that was implicit more explicit. Another important thing about diagrams is that they are types that we access through tokens. We may call a token. Does this one work? Or okay. Color plays no important role here. Here's a triangle, and if you want to make geometry like Euclid 2.5 millennia ago, you can take such a figure and experiment with it and prove certain properties of triangles. But the important thing here is just the typicality of the thing, because this drawing on the whiteboard, of course, is only a token. The same thing if we had it on a computer screen, or if we had it on a piece of paper, or whichever surface that we may like to have it upon. These are all tokens, but they refer to general types, and that's the important thing here, because how on earth can we use this as a diagram of a triangle? It's completely imperfect. You can see this is not even a straight line. It doesn't even fit together there. The line has different breadth. It's very broad here. It's much narrower here. And in any case, line in geometry is something that has a length and has no breadth. So it's an error in the first place that the line has any breadth at all. So there are so many aspects of this token that are erroneous, measured on the fact that we take it to be a triangle. You see, this is not really an angle. This is more like a round curve. There are so many deficiencies of this token, but that only goes to show this very important thing that Peirce addresses here in this short quote. One contemplates the diagram and one at once presents, that means abstracts. That's a strange technical notion that he defines, calling it precision in another sense than the usual English word precision. But one abstracts from the accidental characters that have no significance. So when we see this as a triangle and address the type triangle, we abstract from the fact that the line is has a breadth. We abstract from the fact that it's drawn in red on a white background. You know, the triangle has no color. We abstract from the fact that it is imprecisely drawn in many respects, and by abstracting from all this, we use the token as a sort of telescope, or in some sense, to see the type. So the idea here is that, which also is sort of the key to Peirce's whole philosophy of math, is that diagrams offer for us the possibility of actually accessing general relations by means of this abstraction procedure, where we sort of bracket all the accidental features of the token in order to grasp the type. So that's a very central part of it. So in general, we can say that diagrams are in some sense skeletal icons governed by symbols. You can see this was only a triangle because I told you so in a symbol. I could also have written it on the whiteboard, triangle, and then that would govern your abstraction and give you an idea of which aspects of the token you had to abstract away in order to access the type. Diagrams are types, diagrams themselves, and the generality of the diagram sign then maps onto the generality of the object indicated by the accompanying symbols. And again, they provide possibility for thought experiments. Here we also have him addressing this in a later quote. A diagram is an icon or schematic image embodying the meaning of a general predicate, and from the observation of this icon we are supposed to construct a new general predicate, and this construction is the experiment. So deduction as such in Peirce is simply defined by the manipulation of diagrams. And I think here, which I think is probably also interesting for the arts, that diagrams form a special case here of a more general tendency, which I think is often overlooked, namely the fact that in the general world out there and in the history of image and text, we will see that text and pictures only rarely appear isolated. In most cases they appear together, referring to the same object and supporting the same inference processes regarding the object. Of course, text and pictures may be isolated for special purposes in science or the arts or things like that, but that's more due to the special purposes. Now, let's take a very simple example of a diagram, namely an ordinary topographical map. Here's a map of a small island in Denmark called Fur, and I picked it because large parts of the writing of my book took place in a summer house approximately here, which belongs to my father-in-law, and it can be used as I actually used it in practice after having gone there a couple of times. You know, you arrive here, coming in your car, you take a small ferry boat over here, and then you typically make your way along this road to the house here. When you have taken that road, 3 or 5 times, you get the idea that there must be more entertaining ways to go there, and then that's a point where you can use the map as an experimental tool, because here you can get an idea of the bundle of other ways to go there. You can go this way, you can go this way, you can go all of this way, and you can sort of take all sorts of different ways here. So there's an indefinite amount of ways to go from the harbor to the house, but they are not explicit in the map. I mean, that's the important thing about diagrams, that by making these experiments that are indicated by the trajectory of my finger here, I actually extract some information which was only there implicitly before, namely the bundle of routes taking from the small port and to that particular house. Of course, you could make the same. You could pick any two positions on the map and make similar experiments. So there's a large amount of information implicit in such map, and it's possible. It's possibly impossible for all but artists to memorize all the details of such a map. That's why it's so practical to have it printed out on paper or have it on the GPS of your car, because it surpasses what any of us normal persons can hold in our long-term memory. So that's this with the connections between any 2 points on such a map is of course only one set of diagram experiments you can make with such a map. That's the reason why maps have this strange appearance of inexhaustibility to them. That there are so many different experiments you can do with them. You can also, I mean, if you know about the convention about curves of height in the landscape, you can make other observations which are only implicitly there. I mean, you can, for instance, make the observation that the northern part of the island, roughly this part, is a hilly part. Of course, that's why people like to have houses there, while the southern 2/3 here are considerably flat. Of course, in some sense, that information is on the surface of the map, but the integration of it to cover large parts of the island is only something that you extract by means of a diagram experiment. And similarly, there are all sorts of general information that may be picked out of such a map by means of diagram experimentation. So that's why I think topographical maps form such a central and important category of diagrams. They really give us a large set of ideas of what this diagram experimentation and manipulation is all about. This is a sort of meta diagram. This is a diagram depicting the diagram reasoning process. That you start up with a certain set of premises. I mean, in the topographical map, it could be triangulation measurements of conditions on the ground. It could be aeroplane photographs and things like that. And from such premises, you're able to construct your map, and then in simple cases, you can observe the map and get to your conclusion. In other cases, it's not sufficient to observe the diagram. You have to manipulate it in some sense, as when I made the trajectories on the map with my finger, and then you can observe it once more and get to the conclusion. In still more complicated cases, you will have to add further objects to the diagram. You have to construct it further in order to observe it again and get to the conclusion. That would be the case in many of the classic proofs of geometry. You have to perform some construction on the diagram in order to get at the conclusion. I don't know, I made a sort of plastic lecture here, so now I think we can sort of peter out and stop whenever you wish, because I think we should also have time for the next speaker. But maybe I should just give you a couple more examples in order to.
Oh, go back.
Yeah. Where to?
Yeah, abduction. This is super important.
Yeah, you know, this is another. You know, I've told you this guy Peirce has a tendency to think in triads. He has another triad. This is his distinction between three different modes of reasoning: abduction, deduction, and induction. You probably know the two most well-known of them, deduction and induction. Deduction is necessary conclusions where you, with complete certainty, go from the premises to the conclusion. Only possible in an ideal or idealized world. Induction is when you sort of introduce the empirical world and measurements and samples and statistics and all that. And abduction is even weaker. You can see induction, of course, is weaker than deduction, but abduction is the weakest one, but still very important. Abduction is also what Peirce calls qualified guess. I mean, faced with a certain problem, your next step may be a guess, and any guess will do as long as that guess has the deductive implication that you are trying to explain. So many different guesses will be possible, but you have to make a qualified guess. And then Peirce's idea is that these three typically work together, so that you begin your investigation with an abduction. And then you subject your guess to deduction. You see, you say, if this guess may be right, which conclusions will then follow from it, and then you may proceed to the third step, which is induction. You may compare those deductions that you made in step 2 with reality out there, and if those deductions that you made in step 2 fit with reality, then you have gained some support for your abduction. If not, of course, it's a trial and error process, and you'll have to go back to start and try out another abduction. So that's sort of Peirce's basic idea of how these three modes of inference work together. And here his idea is that phase number 2, the deductive phase, is always a notion of manipulating with diagrams. So in the case with the roads on the island, it's an issue of complete necessity. That given the fact that the map is there and it is correct, then what I find out by manipulating the diagram and taking the different routes on the map is necessarily true. Of course, it may be wrong if the diagram is wrong, but that's another issue. So the idea here is that step number 2 in the investigation here is a diagrammatical step. This is just completely classical diagrams, pre-Peirce. It's Venn diagrams, logic. Taking some sets and the intersection of those sets. Very, very simple and rudimentary diagram reasoning. You can only have up to 4 circles of that sort. After that, it becomes impossible, which you can see from this one, which is a mock Venn diagram. It's one huge joke. This circle here refers to all things that are bad, and I think this one here is things that are really, really bad. Of course, here you have Britney Spears, and she's in an oval here denoting things that lack both style and substance. And here you have two sets which are almost the same. It is French men aged 20 to 36, and the other one is people who don't brush their teeth. So you should see this is sort of a parody of a Venn diagram. Here's a more serious one. It's I mean, like some of Mathew's examples. It's taken from science. It's the first so-called gamma glimpse recorded by NASA's so-called SWIFT program. The gamma glimpse is the largest energy burst in the universe, next to the Big Bang. So it's the largest one we'll ever see, hopefully. But the diagrammatically interesting thing about it is that it is, of course, composed from an enormous amount of single observation of radiation. So here you can see how the diagram synthesizes all this information into one picture, as it were, and it makes possible for us to quickly deduct important information from all this powder-like data. For instance, we can easily judge the size of this gamma glimpse measured on the level of the background radiation, and we can also judge the general structure of such gamma glimpse, that it sort of start out at the highest peak and then it peters out over a period of some 8 seconds or something like that. And of course these are properties which it would take a large amount of data compilation and things like that to deduct if we only had the number pairs. But the fact that we had it synthesized into a diagram makes it easy for us to actually draw those conclusions. I mean, again, examples of Peirce's idea that diagrams allows us to make explicit things which were only implicit in the data. Here's another example which approaches a picture. It's the map of the island of Robinson Crusoe from Daniel Defoe's famous novel, and the reason why it has diagrammatical qualities is not only the fact that it's a bird's eye view from a period when such a view was not really possible, but it's more the fact that different events from the novel are synthesized in the diagram. So in some sense it's a sort of map not only of the island but of the whole narrative of the book, because all the main events are depicted there. So it's a sort of synthesis of narrative time. I mean, I have so many examples, and I will not take all the evening. Maybe this should be the last one, so I can pass the word to the next speaker. But this is Harry Beck's, or I mean, not his, because this is an updated version of it. But that's the London subway system. Of course, it's a diagram that was invented by Harry Beck in 1931. He was the first that got the idea of making a topological representation of subway systems instead of making a map. I mean, if you go back to the maps they had in London of the subway system in the 1920s, you know, there were streets and buildings and all sorts of things which made it a bit hard to keep things clear. But Harry Beck got this idea of abstracting all geographical information away except for the themes running here, and also abstracting away a lot of topographical information, because unlike the map of the island before, which was both distance true and direction true, this map is none of the two, which you can see most directly from this line here, where the stations lie suspiciously close. I mean, you can see from that the scale of this part of the map is not the same as the scale of this part of the map. I mean, we know used to have stations with 100 meters between them, right? So this is just compressed in order to have it on the map. And furthermore, as you can see, the direction of the subway lines has been stylized. There are only 4 directions allowed here: north, south, northeast, southwest, northwest, southeast, and east-west. So all lines have to be composed of line segments of those 4 sources, and of course that's also incorrect as compared to the precise geometrical contours of the real lines. But so all that is left here is topological properties, namely those of connectivity. I mean, that's the basic property of topology. So that's a diagram abstracting away, as Bruce was talking about, abstracting away a lot which would have been there in a topographical map. Of course, that makes the amount of experiments that you can make here much smaller. But that's exactly the point. I mean, you know, you're in a subway station. You are busy. You have to calculate how do I get from Aldgate to Leicester Circle or something like that, and then you don't want to be confused by all sorts of buildings and roads and lakes and parks and things like that. So they are gone, and only connectivity is.
It's a perfect example of what you were describing about the reversion to a type, and also the elimination of. I mean, this comes close as I grew up with this diagram. So the great thing about it is because they remove time and topography, you actually have no idea how long it's going to take you to get anywhere in the system. Which you look at the Paris metro map, which is a map of Paris with all the lines drawn on it, and it's horrible to look at. Quite hard to figure out. You have to look at the end of the line to figure out where you're going.
Yeah. You know, they have done in the Paris example. They have done most of the things that Harry did, but one thing they have not done in the Paris example is the restriction on the direction of the
or this kind of insane, like you would think looking at this, Heathrow Airport was exactly as far from here as here was from here.
Which is emphatically not here.
It's like another hour.
Yeah.
So millions of tourists a year fall like this.
You know, if you sort of made a topographical map, actually in another presentation I have a topographical map of it, and all the central part here, if you took a topographical map, would only occupy this much, and then you would still have Heathrow out there, and Hampton down there, and Epping up there. So the scale differs enormously here. But again, some sort of quick manipulability is one. So if you really in a hurry, you can see in a short while how you get from here to.
But you have no idea it's going to take you forever getting. So oh, thank God I found it. I know where I'm going, but I'm still going to be late.
So
is this a cybernetic diagram?
No, but I would say that I think that there's the implication of a political ontology here too, because you could say that it's reduced for, efficiencies, but I bet if you mapped on other kinds of diagrams onto this statistical distribution of income, the importance of trade, where the hubs are located, I bet there's lots of other things that are invisible in the diagram that it can be extrapolated if you have a certain practice of reading as diagrammatic that finds out its connectivity to other forms, other layers, other diagrammatic layers. If you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean,
it's not just for the facility, it's not just constructed solely for the interaction of a rational subject so that they can interact with it. It also has a kind of political autonomy to the distribution of space, maybe the efficiency of producing maps, all sorts of other kinds of factors.
Oh, you probably can't hear you.
Oh, you cannot. So I mean, because I mean, I actually prefer this very example. Maybe I was just talking, so.
So this, I mean, this is exactly the moment you were talking about with the isotypes in Neurath. This kind of idea that design could create a utopian, but it was something I just wanted to. It also was at the expense.
It's also from the very same period.
Yeah, but it was also at the expense of a kind of idea of the citizen as a unique person, a replacement of the individual time with kind of systemic time, and it was you would sort of know your way.
It corresponds to the city dweller as a rational person making rational calculations of time used in the subway. Of course.
But it also presumes things like, like the New York subway system that was created around the turn of the century needed to be navigated by many people who were immigrant populations that were illiterate. So there had to be a system of interacting with it that didn't require literacy, words, etc., that you could easily access, that had these kinds of internal logical principles. But there's this other kind of, how are you going to get people to mobilize, move around the city if they can't read, right? I mean,
you can also see that this strategy of Rebecca has proven enormously efficient because most city subway networks over the world now use
the system, right?
Of course, you are right that the Paris one is a little bit different, but in the larger perspective, I would also count that as a subversion of this one. And on top of that, of course, it's also a beautiful object in its own right, and many parodies and artworks have sort of been added on top of it. There are hundreds of them out there. So in some sense, it's a very successful diagram.
So is this a good moment to end up?
I think so. I'll just.
Do you have one?
I'll just treat your presentation up. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Personally, I wish you could go on for several more hours.
You could keep it, because we have 10 minutes, right? 20? But no, I mean, left to the thing ends at 7:30.
So this
I'll just keep it. I can.
This is your first.
Oh, that's great. I think I got it. So I'm going to just skip ahead to that. Okay. I'll try to truncate this. I'll talk a little bit about what I was going to do, but I wrote a quick thing about my orientation and my approach to diagrams and why I think they're important. So maybe I'll try to speed through this a little bit, and then I had flagged a couple of segments from the book that I think are particularly appropriate and actually deal directly with Frederik's work and the question of diagrammatics as a potential methodology in the humanities. So my own contribution to this discussion is somewhat more modest, I think, in my own, say, temptation to the diagram. And it began in a slightly inverted way, and it was more utilitarian in nature, in that I was addressing this concrete problem in this book that I just finished on attention. And I thought that perhaps the diagram, or and been thinking through since the book, and I wrote in the introduction, which I wrote last, about how the diagrammatic method might provide a fruitful form of making a limited set of problematics intelligible for the domain of practical reason and potentially for direct action in the sphere of politics. So there is this underlying idea that there is something essentially inherently political about the diagram, at least as a space of the way in which we interact with it. So I'm not a semiotician, I'm not from mathematics, I'm not from the sciences, I'm not even from the social sciences. And so in some ways this is I'm taking on a lot of material that is out of my disciplinary training in this book. But I think that my own interests have also become, I'm trying to skip ahead here. So the importance of, okay, I'm just going to kind of fly through this, and I'm just going to give you a summary of the book a little bit, and then I'll read a section of it that kind of deals with the question of the diagram. So let's see. Okay, so the project. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to read a little bit of this. Okay, so my interest in the diagram became pivotal to find out and to use the diagram and use it to figure out how it is a transfer point for political power by linking that is something that can link regional epistemologies that are synchronic and heterogeneous. And by that I mean that the diagram can be kind of like the subway map here. It can become a point where different states of thinking, of social experience, of epistemic belief systems can coalesce in a single site, and it becomes a kind of transactional space for a certain kind of epistemic heterogeneity. Thus, the importance of diagrams is how they open up that transactional space within the field of politics, as they are places where the signature of a governing rationality within the social formation becomes visible and articulable and achieves interoperability with the individual. It is a site of encounter between the diagram and the individual. It is this site of encounter between the diagram and the individual that is of particular importance because, on the one hand, they can be powerful and a dangerous conscription of domination for us in many cases. But on the other hand, they can also offer us forms of access, generative transformation, experimentation, reappropriation, creativity. And I think some of the ambivalence toward the diagrams was reflected in your comments earlier, Matthew. So this ambivalence makes the diagram itself a kind of fascinating epistemic figure to investigate in itself. And my concern for it and my interest surrounding it are the ideas of how we might consider diagrams to be organized by an interpreter and organized by an interpreter in a context of a political ontology. So my method of investigating diagrams is itself diagrammatic, a diagrammatic method, but it really actually came from studying the concrete case of the way in Dutch diagrams were particularly used in the formation of a new knowledge of cognitive psychology of attention. So it came from a very concrete problem that then came to reflect the whole of the project as a kind of potentially extractable set of methodological principles that might be applicable to other problems. Okay, so very quickly what the book is about, and then I'll read an excerpt, just one excerpt, and maybe show you a few diagrams. So the study of attention, my study of attention here, began with a simple observation that I made, which was how and why in recent years there has been this intensifying focus on the problem of attention, and why that is often intimately connected with its relationship to technology, but also a sense of a need for us to manage ourselves, our time, our bodies, and in some cases our neurochemical anatomy. So in some ways I think in all the disciplinary fields in which attention has been taken up, it has been taken up in many ways as a false problem. And that is including the sciences that study explain it, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, the technologies that intervene and direct it, iPhone, texting, television, gaming, marketing technologies, pedagogy, driving, etc. The psychologies that pathologize and treat it, psychiatry, clinical neuroscience, etc. And other kinds of neurochemical interventions, medicating children for ADHD, or also just maybe in the everyday way in which we use and think about the idea of attention in our everyday popular life. That society has become aware that attention is a problem that needs to be managed and monitored in the family, in childhood development, in gender relations, in the ethos of self-reliance and self-care and anxieties about health, etc., etc. So, despite this, I noticed that the discourse and practices of attention invariably presume to be a singular, natural, self-evident object, without considering the epistemic incommensurability of the heterogeneous elements that comprise what we mean when we use the word attention in any context in this informal way. We kind of presume it to mean something, but it really is involving systems that have nothing to do with each other and in fact are not epistemically commensurable. And so that was the beginning of the problem. How do I try to think about how there is a kind of epistemic space or a kind of, if not a singularity, at least something that is generalizable about our situatedness now in a set of relations that are called, that are mobilized whenever we use this term attention. And that's sort of the place from where I began. So the diagram emerged really as an accidental encounter in the process of research, but it then bent back and kind of became a meta-principle that I applied to some other methodological tools that I was taking from other places. And so I thought maybe it would be a good for me to read a section from the introduction to the book where I try to synthesize the terrain that is covered in the book. And rather than, so I have a little excerpt that I just thought I'd read for you, and it kind of really pertains to this idea of maybe inventing what a diagrammatic method might mean for the use in humanities and social sciences. But beyond that, there's another section where I actually do an analysis of the direct diagrams we talked about before, these feedback and communication diagrams that were part of the cognitive science revolution in the 1950s. And so I could just maybe flash those up and we could talk through those again rather than read. But let me just read this section because I think it dialogues directly with Frederik's earlier observations. Okay. I flagged it. Right place. Okay. Here we go. So, the theory of diagrams has two primary traditions. One is grounded in semiolinguistic theory, symbolic logic, and cognitive reason, and is termed diagrammatology, a method based on, in many senses, practical reason. The other sketches the surface cartography of power relations, following a method of immanent critique that travels from Foucault to Deleuze. Frederik Stjernfelt offers an extraordinary comprehensive theory of diagrammatology that begins from an intervention in traditional semiotic theory blended with the phenomenology of reading signs in the world, exemplified as something Janis Glasgow calls diagrammatic reasoning. Through a revisionist return to the seminal semiotic theory of C.S. Peirce, Stjernfelt builds a new semiotic ontology of the diagram by defending the much maligned iconic sign because it contains the structural conditions for its own extension into new types through a unique form of symbolic reasoning. I'm skipping a bit ahead here. Diagrams are icons that are prototypical in that they put on display the functional interrelationship of parts in the objects they depict to facilitate operational reasoning, which Stjernfelt calls mirology, a phenomenological semiotics that blends Kantian synthetic reason, Gestalt psychology, Husserlian categorical intuition with the doctrines of Jacobson and Helmsleth. The principle of mirology is essential to the ontology of the diagram as a specific kind of operational icon that can perform limitless extension of its real and pragmatic functions from a limited part-whole relationship. So this thing that you're talking about the parts and the wholes, and being able to extrapolate, for example, navigate a map from these very small bits of information, but then there's this kind of endless way in which you can traverse through it. So, for example, and I actually was going to talk about this, I mentioned the topographic map that you mentioned that we just discussed, but I'll skip that over here too. So, the other major theory of the diagram comes from Deleuze and via Foucault, and argues that a diagram is a different kind of cartographic power that maps the political distribution and the multiplicity as the multiplicity of force relations, which are referred to here as diagrammatics for the shorthand purpose of distinguishing it from diagrammatology. Diagrammatics is a method that helps to form maps between discourses and non-discursive practices. Unlike diagrammatology, which involves logical abstraction by parallel forms of reasoning governed by mirological internal part-whole relations, diagrammatics uses the diagram as the transference of an abstract function across heterogeneous discourses whose propositions are epistemologically incommensurable, as well as those between discursive statements and non-discursive practices. For Deleuze, diagrammatic abstraction is not logical, but analogical. It always links a particular case or given system to another. A diagram is not a form of rationality or a typology of signs, as perhaps it is for you, Frederik. A diagram is more of an abstract machine in the sense that it is dispersed throughout and immanent to the entire social body. It is not conceptually abstract, but functionally abstract. The diagram is a mechanism of abstraction that captures the unseen power relations that assemble together a diversity of functions. So, the diagram as an abstract machine is a hybrid figure between the Deleuzian assemblage and Foucault's tantalizing underdeveloped concept that was perhaps an overarching objective that drove his later methodology, and that is the dispositif. The dispositif, usually translated as apparatus or strategy, also contains the sense of assemblage, arrangement, disposition, management, and capture of things according to a particular plan, action, or goal, or decision. So I want to foreground three peripheral comments made by Foucault on the nature of dispositif, just to conclude with this section here, that may not only be useful in the study of attention ahead of this book, but also might contribute to a further refinement of the dispositif as method. They are devices that correspond to the temporal phase of the dispositif as a process of dynamic transaction among force relations that are always producing and reproducing social and political effects that were not part of the intended results of the initial strategy.
and as a consequence end up changing the organization of the discursive and non-discursive practices, the institutional orders, and the forms of subjectification that comprise it. The phases are 1, functional overdetermination, 2, strategic elaboration, and 3, strategic completion. Basically, functional overdetermination is the idea that the disposition is always comprised of too many functions to be accounted for in a singular set of concepts. The strategic elaboration is the way in which the strategy is continually adapting to contain and produce new forms of knowledge and relations of power. And strategic completion occurs when the unintended effect of a strategic elaboration is, in a sense, coheres into its own strategy that is defined by another set of problematics. To demonstrate how this might function as a methodological device for the analysis of attention, I might return to the example that I will deal with in the first section of part 2, the dispositive pharmacological intervention in the dominant treatment of ADHD that exploded in the early 1990s. The strategy composed of an overdetermination of functions found in the diagnostic criteria of psychiatry, the government backing of neuroscience research, the development of manufacture of new psychostimulants by the pharmaceutical industry, partially financed through public capital investment, a technical retraining of teachers and diagnosticians, the moral education of society toward the treatment of behavior disorders and behavioral disorders as neurochemical deficiencies, the modification of insurance policy coverage, etc., etc., etc. Each element generated its own effects, and it pushed the strategic elaboration of the dispositif to continually adjust and contain the problem by new means. For example, the geometric increase of attention disorders in children over the course of a decade that demanded pharmaceutical companies enlisted marketing agencies to rebrand attention drugs through the use of to teens and adults, etc., etc. So that's a kind of idea of the elaboration of an initial set of strategies that then kind of morph off into all these new sort of attendant possibilities as people are negotiating this kind of terrain of power around a particular set of social problems. So just the last part here is, my position is that diagrammatics is a method for mapping the topology of the attention complex that can move through particular cases toward the understanding of what's lying beneath, which is a political ontology. The specific methodological tools I've assembled here will be brought to the process of diagramming the dispositif of attention, but I would prefer to leave the reader with an incomplete explanatory sketch rather than indicate in the analysis ahead how, when, and where each is used. It is preferable that the tool is developed, it remains inherent in the concrete analysis that unfolds, that is, in many cases, the concrete diagram of the feedback that we talked about. And so the method I've assembled above will recur throughout the book and reading it in certain ways. So this is kind of the extrapolation of things that I encountered in the concrete reading of certain diagrams as I was trying to think through how this complex of relations of attention both existed synchronically in different periods, but is also kind of transforming in time and moving from, say, various kinds of epistemic generalities or tendencies at a given moment in history that kind of change in very sudden fashion without kind of overemphasizing the idea of breaking with other periods. So I'll leave it there. I know where.
Show the diagram.
I'll show the diagrams. Yes. I'm trying to rush it. Okay. So the diagrams, right? Yes, diagrams. So these are diagrams in the book, and they come from a number of places, but generally they're all sort of dated from the period of the late 1940s to the early 1960s, which is a time when there's this enormous explosion, such synchronic explosion of research in cybernetics, which is multidisciplinary, but also in cognitive science, which is happening more within sort of disciplinary institutional forms like universities and research centers. So this is a diagram of what one would refer to as just the general feedback loop, which is attributed to many people, has no one source, but it basically is the idea of a feedback as an important modeling a way that a control system can operate, where a system will take input from it'll take from its output and feed that back into input to moderate or regulate the homeostasis of that system. This is very important for Wiener and his idea of stochastic processes, but also systems theorist Bertalanffy, Bateson and Mead applies this they apply this both to kind of social systems, et cetera, and Peter is a kind of operations research guy. Different forms of the multidisciplinary cybernetic complex. This is a basic, fundamental thing that you see just iterated a thousandfold all over the place in this period. It's a kind of a meme or a trope that you see emerging. This is another meme or a trope, and it happens more or less concurrently, at least in proliferation. You see it emerging over. And this is the general communication system by Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver, which is basically thinking about how we can mathematically build mathematical efficiency into communication systems by reducing the signal-noise ratio. So in other words, how can we most efficiently determine what is meaningful in a message that's sent from one channel from a sender to a receiver? Very important model. And in this same article that was published originally in 1949 and again in 59, you see an addendum later in the same article where they actually manipulate the diagram to add new elements. And particularly, they add this idea of a corrective observer, a corrective mechanism that can monitor from sort of the outside of the system, kind of do bit parity checks at different points of the system to modify the feed as it goes on. So it's a kind of expanded feedback loop that a psychologist by the name of Kenneth Craig in the UK was the first to think of as a kind of potential human operator that is managing or observing a machine. So you're thinking about a kind of transduction between a human system and an information system. And this is kind of what is leading out of Claude Shannon and Weaver's model, but it's all contained in this article, and it's summarized in a sense in this transference of one diagram to the next. Now, this is very interesting. This is a I would almost say a generative or defining case of a diagram for the explosion of attention research. It was established in 1958. It was made by somebody named Donald Broadbent, instrumental in bringing kind of the refutation of behaviorism into the world of cognitive psychology. And it's basically what he calls the limited capacity filter model, which is taking a combination of the feedback loop, but also the idea of many of the communication system management theories that were brought from Claude Shannon and Weaver, and they consolidate them into this diagram, which is a diagram of how attention actually functions. And he feels like he's discovered this. He's actually taken this hybrid principles from a number of places. He's discovered that attention is actually a capacity. The human being is like, they operate like a kind of a communication channel network. They have a capacity for a certain bandwidth of information, and there's a limit to that capacity. And attention is the faculty that monitors that. Okay. And then finally, the limit to that capacity.
So we're way past it. I think we're way past it, so keep going.
So there you go. So I'll just the attention, that gets modified yet again and again and again and again. And you see this iteration explosion of these new diagrams that add new features. When does that limit happen? How does it function? We bring forms of statistical probability, et cetera, and until you get to the 1980s, where that old model of the cognitive begins to decline, and attention becomes repurposed within the system as a concept of resource management, which is very conducive to a new liberal, kind of neoliberal model of self-care, self-reliance. Attention is your responsibility, attention is your faculty, but it's a resource that you have to manage to govern the system yourself. Either you medicate yourself, you monitor how many video games you play, et cetera, but it's a completely different ideological and political economic climate in the 1980s. And that's mapped into this new diagrammatic space. So the diagram becomes a way of understanding how the political function of its use changes, and through that you can read a whole other sets of social relations. That's the concept.
And this kind of thing, what's striking to me is how much they resemble computer chips.
Oh, yes. I mean, that's, yeah.
Like the very thing that is destabilizing the system. It's a biochemical pathway, and a computer chip are the bad inputs. These are the bad inputs, and we need to, filter them out, or ultimately, rather than structure the model where it's sort of like it's a cognitive faculty of yours. It's like you actually have to kind of meddle with it in a sense. But so it's moving away from the computational here. Is it been pretty static since 1984? Is this the kind of, or is there?
Well, it's funny because when there's these epistemological movements, they're not totalizing. There still is cognitive research and attention. It just gets replaced within the kind of, say, hierarchies of what's generalizable about a given set of research principles. So cognitive science, all these models, the broadband font, it's not as if it's refuted and thrown overboard. It's just, what's happening now, it's being overlaid with neuroscience, right? So now it's about mapping all of these things that we know to be cognitive functions in a neural in the neural network, in that great mapping project you said, I'm sure they're working to do that. So there's this kind of idea of behavioral neuroscience is kind of overlaying these traditional cognitive models. And so it's interesting, so the diagram's changing, but yeah.
Is there a refined definition of that? I'd love to open the floor up to questions and also say that it's time to bring some beer down here.
Yeah, I'm sorry for that.
And then we could bring it down here, and then if people want to ask questions, it will encourage them to come down the front and also drink beer. And maybe Frederik,
yes, drink beer.
Kenneth, you can. Thank you so much. Maybe Frederik, you want to come up here? We can invite. This will be the bar. Come up and,
yeah, let's. Yeah.
You have to come up and ask for a drink. We'll give it to you. So Nicole, you have a question?
Yeah. So Ken, you mentioned in the earlier discussion how that within the diagram the sort of political nature becomes invisible.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if there's the reductive synthetic gesture involved in the creation of the diagram. Is that both the gesture that is political and that ultimately makes it invisible, the political invisible? Like
The reductive synthetic gesture?
yeah, like in the actual act of sort of taking all this information and choosing what to show. Like, is that in itself political, or I'm just curious because you're talking about sort of the interpretation and the politics are revolving around that, but I'm curious about the actual creation, the decision of what to include.
Super good question.
And also, and then actually, for Mathew, then to extend that, then is there a relationship between this process and actual the process of abstraction in general?
Well, to answer the first question, I would say that it's a great question, and I don't know if I can fully answer it. I think, from what I've arrived at, to me, what I think makes it political is the way in which we can extrapolate from a sort of a concrete case, a set of broader heterogeneous political circumstances by trying to use the diagram as a signature for something that is running through the whole of the social body. So in some ways it's like a network. It's like trying to find a network of relations that are embedded in a limited case, right? So the politics isn't necessarily inherent in the model of reading in one way or another. And I think that's kind of why I'm turning to Frederick's works, which I think is absolutely right on and perceptive in terms of how we actually engage with the diagram itself and how it actually makes meaning. I mean, it was reading your book that made me able to read the successive transformation of the limited capacity filter and how that produced knowledge. And it was these kinds of interactions with rational beings encountering a diagram, and the diagram was a kind of space for this moment of knowledge formation. But I'm also trying to read, yes, the invisible relation behind that. It's like there's also other purposes that are operative, right? And so how do we get those from what is already at the surface, not necessarily surface, but what concretely appears, to something that is way more abstract, what Deleuze would call the abstraction of function, not the abstraction of concepts. So what are the multiplicity of functions?
I'm much more clear on that. I don't see a distinction. I'm not grasping the
Yeah, but
distinction.
those aren't the relations themselves are like the act of finding the relations like is that's political, I guess. The relationships that
Well, do you want to address the function thing, and maybe you have something to say about this too, Frederik? This idea of the abstraction, when you talk about the type, right, the sign type, there's a kind of abstraction going on, right?
Yes.
And abstraction is, you could say it's a concept. It's a concept of triangle that we can never quite get at. So we have a token, and there's a way in which the diagram
And the token sort of permits us to see the type. That's the sort of optimistic idea.
Yeah, so that might be operating
You know,
concepts.
that's
Yeah.
been a sort of riddle for years. How do we have access to types? Because you know, basically our perception seems to be very concrete and to see specific, particular tables and persons and things like that. How do we have access to types? So this is, I think, a good idea of how we actually have access to types, and why it is good to have access to types. Of course, because types are simpler than the real world. So types are easier to infer from and to process because they have a limited amount of properties, while empirical particular objects have an infinite amount of properties. That's why it's important to get to types.
So is your question, Nicole, like where does the selection of, like, how does the selection of types take place to begin with?
Or just like, is the selection itself potentially political, and also because it's also a reduction. I feel like to select is to reduce as well.
Yeah, certainly.
And so like in that active reduction, is the reduction actually making any political decision in the choice? Also, is it making that the political?
Maybe I'll try to use a quick example just of it's kind of maybe coming back, and this might help return to this question because of this idea, the difference between conceptual and functional abstraction. In the beginning of your book, in the introduction, you in this wonderful metacritical gesture, you actually create a diagram of the book you're about to read, and you insert it in the introduction, right? And it's a wonderful guidepost because otherwise it's a formidable and daunting project to take on. You're reading your book because it's just so comprehensive.
It's awesome. It's super easy to read.
Yeah, totally. No, you have to read it. You have to read it. But I was scared. I will admit, I was scared. But the diagram became like this beacon because I could return to it, I could see where, because you had reduced, in many ways you talked about this, to the sketch. So you have abstracted in some ways the general outline of the concepts that you're going to outline in much more detailed form. You created a sketch. And in a sense, that is, I think, a good example of conceptual, or like conceptual abstraction. The functional abstraction is to think about the way in which the figure of that diagram encounters not only the text of the space, but perhaps the protocol for the use of images in publishing and copyright management. If you made that or not, who do you have to attribute to? How do you attribute it? It might involve the idea of the political economy of book publication itself. It might involve the way in which the relation of, I'm short on examples right now. The general idea of let's say, image-text relations in publications of other types or other kinds, you know, and that there's a genre that you're using. I'm hard-pressed to come up with immediate ideas within a little. But the idea is that there's a way in which it functions within the interrelationships of parts of the book as well, that isn't just about, it's abstracting the concepts. And I think that's kind of what Lewis is getting at. That's it. I'm groping towards.
But I think that was an interesting feature of the question here that was not addressed. I mean, your idea was that any selection of properties for a particular diagram must have some political implications or something like that. And I think if you take politics in a sufficiently broad sense of the word, of course, I think that's the case, and that has to do with the fact that the properties of the object that you select for your diagram is, of course, the ones you are interested in. I mean, if you take the London subway map, I mean, you can make 10,000 other maps of the same geographical area, Greater London, and you can take out all sorts of different features. I mean, you can make a map of London charting the income distributions of the different areas. You can make a map charting the ethnic composition of different parts of London, or you can. I mean, you can make so many different maps, and some of them may have explicitly political issues, and other maybe more implicit. But in all cases, when you make a diagram, you have to select certain properties and leave out others. And of course, that selection is potentially political. So in that sense,
this is something. Thinking about your distinction, Ken, was this on all of your diagrams. There was this question of output. You know, it's like the diagram was understood to have a desired output or an end state, which is that kind of political choice. Like it's a predetermined, that the question of output, so this is why Harman calls this axis between sort of like essences or types and like us or interpretants, the axis of duplicity, because essentially there's so much pre-selection that it's like, it's obviously a scale, but there's no kind of such thing as an objective diagram until you step outside the abductive axis and go into kind of more like pure guesswork, which is, so that's where this kind of these questions of amplitude, I guess. I wondered in your research if you've noticed a kind of wave of this question of output, like in 1941.
I have no idea what you're drawing, by the way, so I just say no. I need to respond to that.
So this is versus diagram. There you go. Induction, deduction, abduction. And this adds on Harman's little extra thing of speculation, which is sort of what's on the other side of the abductive axis. Like this, and he says sort of this line you can't get to real objects. But this is what he called essences, or like the pure nature of things. It's basically your diagrams, like a.
Well, it looks like it.
So this is where sort of Husserl's world happens. It's like the relationship between space and time, and this is where sort of human activities occur between, and then this is where two relations occur. It's like Heidegger. It's like kind of old. But the question, and these are amplitudes in the sense of something that seems very clear since 1941 in the way that your diagrams accelerate is an acceleration of diagram production, an acceleration of reconsiderations of the system. But is there a reconsideration of the basic terms or types? And is there a reconsideration of the questions of outputs? Or are they just more complicated? Like, is it basically nesting, or is it turning into a different kind of diagram?
I think that you see at this one moment in history both nesting, but also a proliferation of cases, of typological cases, right? So you see at this moment an enormous expansion of a particular kind of diagram that is happening across many, many different subsets of scientific research. You see it in communications research, you see it in mathematics, you see it in biology, you see it in political science, the idea of managing the feedback as a tool of political governance. You see it in the rise of cognitive psychology. But the basic elements within a limit are topological in that there are certain elements that are always there, they always appear. It's a kind of topology because it's really about how you stretch or bend that figure, but still basically a feedback system is a feedback system in the end, right? They're all modified for different purposes and cases. So my question is, there is something behind that drives this shift that's happening in totally heterogeneous spheres. I mean, if you think about the way in which epistemic space occurs in political science, it's totally different from the way that it occurs in cognitive science, cognitive psychology, or mathematics, or communication information theory. They're different. They're dealing with different substances, different objects. They have different methodological precepts and purposes. They have different institutional research bases and traditions, different kinds of publication tactics, all of that. So the knowledges are totally indistinct. They're not superimposable as epistemological structures, and therefore the episteme goes away.
But they are superimposable as networks. They actually follow all exactly the same.
And it's through the diagram that you can map out the network relations by looking for the signature within the diagram that connects it to others. And from that you can extrapolate what the larger set of relations are at a given moment. And that's where the function becomes important, because it's that abstraction of function that can move from one to the other that makes it powerful. Because if you can move a diagram of cognitive attention from a laboratory where you're theorizing the attention system as a human network, and you can extrapolate that and you can make that operational in, say, an Air Force pilot who has to monitor a radar screen in the rising Cold War complex where you have AWACS and these systems of monitoring where you need to be able to modulate an individual in front of a screen so that they won't make mistakes, they won't let a bomb come by, whatever, I don't know whatever. That is a very direct set of relations of a function that it functions one way in the abstract research, but it's presented through the diagram to make it operational in another sphere of society. And that transferability is the way in which we can think about what's generalizable without saying
this is an epistemic moment. This is what Crary does in some ways, whose work I really
God,
admire.
tell us what epistemic means.
Well, the episteme, epistemic. Okay, Foucault has this thing about epistemic space where you have, you know, his early work. He started with this concept of the episteme.
Episteme is like it's a regime system, right? Meaning
It's
regime.
basically saying that across all orders of knowledge at a given moment, there are generalizable tendencies that are the same. And there's scientific,
That's
like Kuhn.
Foucauldian.
It's Foucauldian, it's Kuhn, in
Yeah.
some ways it's, Bachelard has a version of this. There's a lot of history science people that think this way. But it's the idea that we live in the Renaissance, there was a kind of epistemic condition that extended throughout, it permeated everything. And it's a unified space. I think it's more like Riemann space. It's more like you have these epistemic bubbles that have nothing to do with each other, that can't really talk to each other, but yet are connected through some kind of invisible, what else to say, but power
Paradigm?
force relations.
Paradigm? Similar?
The paradigm,
Zeitgeist?
that's the paradigm, zeitgeist, ideology,
Approximation.
there's lots of other things.
This is sort of
This is
zeitgeist.
Yeah.
With all the problems that zeitgeist theories always have.
The difference, and this is what Foucault says in why he abandons the episteme and moves to what he calls epistemologization or the dispositif, is the dispositif can account for heterogeneity, whereas the paradigm, according to Kuhn, basically says there's rules that are governing the formation of knowledge at a given time. You know, we're in Eisensteinian physics, you know, abandon Newtonian, and there's a break, and it's a new epistemic space that's kind of totalizing.
But there's still a large difference between Foucault's old notion of episteme and Kuhn's paradigm.
Oh, yes.
Kuhn's paradigm is delimited to single sciences, while the old Foucauldian idea was actually, as you say, sort of zeitgeist idea that there was one structure pervading a whole period and everything that went on in that period. And I think that's probably.
It actually comes from Kangelhelm, who studied
Yeah,
it,
yeah.
and Kangelhelm had this idea of the polyvalence of scientific concepts. So you have a concept that, say the reflex concept he writes about, or you have a concept like the feedback, but you can have theoretical polyvalence around the concepts. The feedback diagram is a perfect example of that. You have one concept, basically, but there's any number of theories that can be attached to that. And so that was what Foucault did, is he took that, he inverted it, he said, no, you have the same concept in different epistemic regimes at a given time. So you have the idea of man in life, in political economy, all these different spaces, but it's the unification of concepts. So it comes from Kangelhelm, but you're right, it's very different from Kuhn in many ways, but they're often, Agamben unties that in a very nice way.
They are often confused. But I think Kuhn is a much more narrow claim than epistemic.
I agree, and I think it was addressed to the scientific community.
Yeah.
So I'd just like to go back to what's really bugging me now. Are you saying that sort of diagrammatology and diagrammatics are, in terms of this topological diagram, are they sort of isomorphic to each other in any way? Or are they, how do they exist?
I guess I was expressing that in terms of how I'm trying to extrapolate these as a part of a method, because I really, in the end of the book, I really had to think hard about method. How do you approach a very vast kind of problem? I mean, I could have gone Marxist, I could have gone psychoanalytic, I could have gone, there are a lot of methods out there, right? And I blended a lot of things.
I don't think you can just go Marxist.
I'm not that cavalier. I'm kind of being cheeky on that, but I guess in the end there were too many different modes of analysis. I was piecing this thing together, and your work was so. In the end, I was like, the diagram's a very nice figure to kind of hold the methodological principles by blending what I was saying, the diagrammatology, which is actual nuanced practice of how we actually read diagrams, the careful understanding of how that occurs, all the, that you basically have a compendium of an incredible kind of phenomenological, ontological system of reading, understanding, semiotic things we call diagrams. At the same time, there was something else behind that I was really trying to get at, and so diagrammatics is more of a condition of diagrams that is more abstract thinking that you're really trying to get to, that is about their function, their relationship,
Uses.
Their ontology is political in this other sense. Their uses, but I mean, use is implied in it. That's why I really like the stuff on the icon in Paris. I guess it's what I mean is. Here, I'll say it by way of example. What Deleuze says of Foucault, he says that the panopticon is not a machine for seeing and not being seen. It's a diagram of disciplinary power, but you can only see it in the concrete case of Bentham's panopticon, or other places like schools or systems that are distinct from it. But really, it's a diagram of a larger set of conditions, of networks, of relations between a lot of things. It is about ordering the body, it is about disciplining society, it is about population, all of these things that can be seen in this one very simple model of the prison. So the prison is actually itself a diagram in its concreteness, but that's invisible. And so that's kind of that's what diagrammatic. That's what I mean by diagrammatic. It's not really a diagram. It's diagrammatic. It's functioning like a diagram, but it's not.
It's a diagrammatic reading of a physical condition.
Yeah. But it's funny. I appreciate the way that you distinguish between diagrammatology and diagrammatics, because if I look back at my personal development as a scholar, I would say that diagrams was, I can see that now, was something that I turned to in order to get away from the whole Foucault-Deleuze.
Right. And I know, and I can see that. That's why I pulled that quote out.
I was a student in the Ritchie. This whole Foucauldian Deleuzian thing was all the talk of the town, and I was part of it. But after some 10 years, I became extremely tired of it. Also because of the fact that it occurred to me politically problematic. I think Foucault turned out not to have any positive grasp of modern politics, and later it turned. I don't know if you discovered that, but he was a staunch fan of Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution, and he wrote a lot about that, which is luckily forgotten. He thought, the Iranian Revolution was a spiritual thing that would do away with the false universality of the Enlightenment and things like that, and it occurred to me as crap. So I thought we need something else here, and that's so I see diagrams as a sort of saving raft for me to get away from.
I totally identify with that, because I was also oversaturated and overburdened with this sort of probably a later wave of the last gasp of this post-structural kind of and so that's why I pulled that quote out before, because it's the only place you really mention that tradition, and you say, the icons and the line of these people, but likewise it made me come back and rethink about semiotics, which in many ways I had become had been written off by art history, by visual studies, semiotic idealism, to really address it in a new way through Peirce as a kind of pragmatics. And I would say that I'm not a Deleuzian, I'm not a Foucauldian. I take from them very selectively, and I don't take it's the cases in the book, but I do find that there are elements that are useful. If you take them out and you use them, they're like tools.
Well, also, it's not surprising, since the field you're investigating is something that originates in the 1940s, that it would essentially be inflected with the flavors of all the time up to the 80s when Foucault's at his peak, and then it's like, the question I would love us to address, and please, more questions. Is this kind of, one is like this idea of hope. Go back to this, like, what constitutes a sustainable gesture in that, like sort of post-Deleuze, post-Foucault, and now we have maybe this possibility opening up again of a kind of pragmatism, which also, but is very much in the language of the time. We have a pragmatic president, and he deals with things pragmatically, and everyone's actually getting kind of tired of how pragmatic he is about everything. So that may be,
I think that's another use of the word pragmatic.
Right? Like it kind of becomes this you know, its own. It implies a kind of order of these sort of scholar priests who are just like doing the right thing all the time.
Yeah.
And that's like not happening.
I don't know. What do you?
In addressing that question about what's next, I also have a question and a point of discussion. I would pose that data analysis is kind of the underlying contemporary dialogue that interacts with diagrams. It's what policy analysts use. They don't analyze philosophy so much as they collect data and then analyze that and try to come up with a conclusion based on where the data points are. So in this instance, the receptors or the sensors that come up with input are extremely important in our contemporary dialogue of how we understand the world. So that's one point for discussion. The other point of discussion is I think diagrams are proliferating today because you cannot hold in your mind all the data points. It's just not happening. So you have to have a diagram. And I think that's interesting across fields now. In order for fields to communicate across data sets, there's some standardization of diagram. And I think we're in a time that standardization is not complete. Like, people have to communicate across professions. Like at the Pentagon, the data analysts have to talk to the generals, have to talk to the people on the ground, as we were talking that one example.
Or the Obama White House has this thing called the no diagram, which is the only place, because everyone has to be positive in all the meetings, so they get fired. They have an in-house software that's the no diagram, where you're allowed to place your reservations about a policy within the diagram. Then you will then go to the meeting the next day and be like, oh, yeah, I'm all for it. But you can secretly, you know, it's kind of an anonymized data like gathering system for people to actually register dissent.
So I guess rather than complicate things, yes, can we address like data analysis in contemporary life as it relates to your research, as it relates to where the discussion is going in the future? It's a big kind of generalized.
I wanted to bring this up because you've done a lot of writing about conditions and the former, what we used to call Eastern Europe. And
Yeah, I think there are more than one issue up here at the same time. I mean, the issue that you bring up with data analysis, I think, is very important, and I think it's going on in many branches. I mean, in Aarhus, where I used to be at a small center for semiotics, I mean, all the young semioticians were making experiments and collecting data, but obviously they need, as you also indicated, they need diagrams to synthesize those data. I mean, it won't do just to give long lists of correlated data. I mean, that takes you nowhere, so you have to have some diagrams to synthesize them. I think that's taking place on a broad scale. But I mean, you raised the issue of politics and what we can hope for and things like that. I mean, I don't address that in the diagram book at all. I mean, I see that, maybe I'm wrong, I see that as a completely unpolitical conclusion. But that doesn't mean that, you know, I wrote some other books which are highly political about, I wrote 2 books together with a friend on the Balkan Wars. They were not translated into English, they were translated into Serbian and Swedish and some other languages. So I've been much preoccupied with certain topics on politics.
I guess I raise it because
Yeah.
it seems to be a part of there's a question of like data analysis in response to conflict. You know, like this is where Harman talks about time as the axis of confrontation. And it's also a direct question of like, I have a 9-year-old, you know, and the school is busy telling all the 9-year-olds to pay more attention, to which all the parents are like, they're 9-year-old boys, I mean, what do you want? This is what, they're all the same. But there is another school, which some of his friends are at, where they medicate all the same peer group. The school insists that they all consume drugs. And it's like, this is a conflict. Like, it's a microcosm of a conflict which is supposed to be resolvable through the intervention of a powerful state with a sophisticated pharmaceutical apparatus, which, you know, in microcosm is, you know, when you look at something like Ukraine happening, it's like, well, we don't have the data. But maybe if we sort of medicated everybody, the problem would just go away. You know, like this kind of liberal, you know, it's like the liberal democracy response is like, we don't know what to do, but wouldn't it be great if everyone just calmed down and looked logically at the data, which doesn't exist because there's not any actual data gathering equipment. There's just a bunch of really angry Cossacks who've been like being massacred for like 1,000 years. And they're like, this sucks. So how do we, you know, like, so there is a kind of direct, like, pragmatic relation. But there's, I guess the question I'm asking in that very line is like, what type of diagram could address the absence of data? Because we are we're going to be overburdened. We're already overburdened with diagrams that contain data, but what we need is diagrams that show us how to function, not on the basis of inadequate data, but on the basis of kind of this.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons your book is timely, and to address the question on political data education, I think we're realizing that so much of our social interaction is also simultaneously mediated in these sort of these nether worlds of digital cloud clusters of our data that has a sort of imprint of our where we've been and what we do and all these things, and we know I think a more informed practice of reading, maybe diagrammatically, is something that can potentially empower one. So there might be a political project, even buried in the idea of giving people a set of tools to read diagrams. But to the question that you were talking about, I was thinking about with your son that brain project, what is that called?
Connectome.
The Connectome. So I looked that up briefly before I got here. It's funded by the NIH and the NIMH for like $30 million each, like for a 5-year huge research project, big science, and yet these research sort of public funding of sometimes private institutions or universities to do a bit like a genome project that creates this, is going to map the brain so that they can have these more accurate representations of neurochemistry. They say to solve all sorts of the world's problems. You know, it's going to cure autism. It's going to get rid of Alzheimer's. All the, so it has this.
We're like the last guys.
But what are the real?
Get rid of us.
Agendas behind a big public health research organization? The kinds of financing that they offer to map the brain that way. It's not just this. There's real capital invested in that. There's ways in which pharmaceutical industries that create new drugs now, they don't even know what they're doing. They're not even for anything. They just like find something that will interact with the synapse in a certain way, and then they patent it, and then they'll figure out how to market it later, or they'll blend these things in cocktails. So there's a whole kind of way in which data set, the kind of political economy of like this idea of acting on the neural substrate of the human body, a kind of economics of self-care. All these things are kind of conjoined. And, as you're skeptical about the attention thing.
Well, it's because it's exactly as it's both of your projects unite. It's the internalization of a pragmatics of a diagram. I mean, we literally have a diagram with a teacher of how he should deal with the feedback. It's a totally pragmatic thing, but it's totally politicized as well on this other side, diagrammatology. It's like it's to conform to expectations that are external to the premise of the diagram. The question becomes, I think, here at an arts institution, to what extent can we articulate the basic terms of the diagram? And to what extent are those terms, as Nicole was asking, so preordained by external structures? Like, there's a way of kind of reconstituting the diagram, not only as a passive tool, but as I don't want to say a weapon, but as an active tool to question pre-ordering pre-ordered systems. And that's, of course, its utility, but also its fatal, its Achilles heel, is that it likes to just make lots of more connections. It will infinitely connect, as you said. It's got an affinity problem.
Could I put the question back to the audience? Because I'm not an artist, and you're all artists, so I think one of the things that we challenge artists to do is have an
Steve,
insight and
don't look
responsibility
down.
to
I saw you.
respond.
I saw you there.
You know?
No, I had
Don't call him.
a separate question.
Okay, well, I mean, okay, then you could, yeah.
Which is very related to what
I'd like to
Matthew just
hear.
said, as far as how could that continue into the abstraction of function that you're talking about, the transferability, how can that get folded back into some of the dangers that we see in data visualization, et cetera, and how that can be used. I guess it seemed like you were positing the abstraction of function as full of potential for in some political way, but I'm wondering if you could articulate that a little bit.
Okay, I would say this, that the political, because I don't really have, believe it or not, a direct, I mean, I state in some ways that I have a political investment in the subject, in some ways, because I do. And I would say this, there's a way in which thought can sometimes give us a space to distance ourselves from an environment in which we're going to have to engage and act, so that we can act in a more empowered way, in a more appropriate way, as human beings in our society, if we have more access to the things that we're up against in all their complexity. So I think the small gesture that I think that this book, or in a different way Frederik's book might contribute, is to help give you, if you know, scholarship are in a sense just some tools that might enable you to, as practitioners, act in the world in a way that gives you more agency, that gives you more freedom. And if I'm creating in some ways a diagram of something I think is the attention complex, and there's something in there that has some utility and connects to something that you are trying to achieve in your practice, whether it's political practice or artistic practice, whatever it is, that's something that we mutually share in a space of kind of communal responsibility. And that's why, you know, there might be people who say, oh, you know, semiotic idealist, you know, Husserl, it's, you know, like, I don't subscribe to the post-struct, those dividing lines are done for me anyway. But the ones that we both traditionally kind of, maybe different generations, but I think that you should take from anyone and anywhere. But ultimately, there is this, the politics isn't just in the content, it's in who you're talking to and what you see the function, again, the function of the book is to lay out some tools that might be usable by another person in some other context, right? And in that sense, your book, there was a real value in my project that I could take from that, and it enriched what I was doing. So that's a kind of collaborative space that we just met today.
But I also like the way that you phrase it in terms of agency and freedom and things like that. And if I should say something about politics, I would say, but which tradition that we have those norms from, and that is the tradition of the Enlightenment that was so vilified by Foucault and these other French guys. So I would rather, do you know these books by Jonathan Israel, sitting down in Princeton, writing about the radical Enlightenment? I mean, they are fantastic books. I mean, he has sort of rewritten the whole intellectual history of the Enlightenment through the last 10. You know, he's written 3,000 fucking papers on the Enlightenment, from Spinoza to the French.
And I love that stuff.
In fantastic detail, and his observation is that all the important concepts relating to modernity, like agency and freedom and things like that, comes out of a specific sub-tradition of the Enlightenment, namely the radical part of it. You know, the Spinoza, Pierre Bayle, Diderot line of Enlightenment. So this argument, which I think has much to it, is that we have sort of overlooked some very important cultural DNA in our own background.
I think a lot of that is that the French philosophers in the 20th century were just sort of cross that it wasn't the French who ultimately benefited from the Enlightenment. They sort of ended up kind of just, everyone didn't end up speaking French. And it's kind of like they're still really annoyed about that. It's like, we invented the whole thing, it was awesome.
Yeah, but
and now you make fun of us. It's horrendous.
I mean, they are also sad with these books because his claim is that it all comes out of Holland. They were there before, they were there 50 years before the
Yeah, they're,
French came there. They were there, I mean, Amsterdam 1660, that's where Enlightenment starts.
Well, see,
according to his
I would argue it's
detailed
the 12th
research.
century England, because I'm British.
Of course you will.
But I think we should, but feel free to sort of come up here and have beers, but maybe we'll conclude this sort of formal way you sit there quietly and listen to us talk part of it. And you can sit here noisily and well.
And I would just say, I'd like to hear, that last vote, what kind of engagements are at stake for your own, whether it's art practice or some other kind of practice you feel.
well, okay,
So pull up a chair. Pull up a chair.
You know,
So you don't have to make it so.